a beloved Hollywood icon, forever frozen in glamour, pulled lifeless from the freezing Pacific. Yet the true tragedy of Natalie Wood didn't begin in the dark water. It started decades earlier, under the terrifying control of her own mother. Forced to perform with a shattered wrist at age 10 to secure a studio paycheck, Wood's entire existence became a performance of survival. But how did a former child star, conditioned to fear the water above all else, end up drowning in it while her husband inexplicably delayed calling for help? This is the cold, physical reality of Hollywood's darkest unsolved mystery. Natalie Wood was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco. Her parents, Nikolai and Maria Zakharenko, had come to the United States from Russia after the chaos of revolution and civil war. Nikolai, who later changed his name to Nick, worked as a carpenter and tried to build a stable life for his growing family. Maria, born Maria Stepanovna Gurdina, was the real force in the household. She had grown up in a world of hardship and lost dreams, and she saw in her daughters the chance to escape everything she had endured. The family already had one daughter, Olga, known as Lana, born in 1936. When Natalie arrived, Maria immediately focused her energy on the new baby. The United States in 1938 was still pulling itself out of the Great Depression. Hollywood was the glittering capital of escape, where ordinary people could become stars, and poor immigrant families could rewrite their futures. Child actors were in demand, and studios treated them as valuable but replaceable assets. Maria understood the rules of this world from the beginning. She changed the family name to Gurdon to sound more American and began pushing her children toward the cameras almost as soon as they could walk. Life in the early years was modest. The family lived in a small apartment in San Francisco before moving south to Los Angeles when Natalie was still very young. Money was tight, and Maria made it clear that the children's success in show business was the only way out of poverty. Natalie was 4 years old when she first appeared in front of a camera. Her early roles were small, but Maria made sure she was noticed. The girl had large, dark eyes and a natural ability to follow directions, qualities that casting directors liked. Maria coached her constantly, teaching her how to smile on cue, how to cry when needed, and how to hide any sign of fear or discomfort. At home, the lessons were stricter. Maria believed that discipline and absolute obedience were the keys to survival in Hollywood. She monitored every aspect of Natalie's life, what she ate, who she played with, and how she spent every hour of the day. Any sign of independence was quickly corrected. The year 1949 marked a turning point that would leave a permanent mark on Natalie's body and deepen the patterns of obedience she had already learned so well. At 10 years old, she landed a more substantial role in The Green Promise, a film that promised to showcase her growing ability to handle dramatic scenes. The production took the cast and crew to a rural location where sets had been built to simulate a stormy farm environment. One of the key sequences required Natalie to run across a wooden bridge that was rigged to collapse dramatically once she reached the far side. The director explained the timing carefully, assuring everyone that the structure would hold until Natalie was safely across. Maria stood nearby, as always, watching every rehearsal and reminding her daughter to move exactly as instructed. On the day of the actual take, the cameras rolled and Natalie began her sprint. The bridge gave way far earlier than planned, the supports snapping while she was still midway across. She plunged into the churning water below, the current pulling at her small frame as she grabbed desperately at the remaining planks. The fall slammed her against rocks and debris, and in the struggle her left wrist snapped with a sharp crack. The bone broke clean through and protruded visibly beneath the skin, but the cameras kept turning because the director wanted the raw panic captured on film. Natalie screamed in terror and pain, her voice carrying across the set. But the scene continued until the director finally called cut. She was pulled from the water, shivering and crying, her wrist already swelling and turning colors. Maria rushed to her side, but instead of calling for immediate medical help, she pulled her daughter aside and assessed the injury herself. The studio had invested time and money in the production, and Maria feared that any delay or report of an accident would label Natalie as fragile or difficult. She made a quick decision that would affect her daughter for the rest of her life. Bypassing any mandate for an ambulance or a set doctor, Maria tightly wrapped the fractured wrist in whatever cloth she could find and insisted that Natalie finish the remaining shots of the day. The girl, still in shock and fighting tears, obeyed because she had been trained that disappointing the production or her mother could destroy everything they had worked for. The bone was never properly set. It healed crooked over the following weeks, leaving a noticeable bony protrusion that would always be visible on her left wrist. From that moment on, Natalie began wearing wide bracelets or long sleeves in every public appearance and every film role, turning the injury into a hidden signature that only those closest to her understood. Production on The Green Promise wrapped, and Natalie moved straight into other roles that kept her schedule full through the early 1950s. She appeared in Father Was a Fullback alongside Fred McMurray, playing a daughter in a family comedy that required her to deliver light-hearted lines while hiding the lingering soreness in her wrist. Maria continued to manage every aspect of her daughter's life, choosing the projects, negotiating the contracts, and ensuring that Natalie never had time to question the pace. The family's finances had improved, but Maria's grip on her daughter never loosened. She scheduled auditions back-to-back, arranged tutoring sessions around filming, and monitored Natalie's interactions with other children on set. Any sign of fatigue was met with reminders of the bridge incident and the constant threat of losing their livelihood. Natalie learned to smile through headaches and to perform scenes with perfect energy, even when her wrist ached from the cold or from holding props for long takes. The studios praised her professionalism, noting how reliable she was for a child her age, but they never saw the quiet moments when she would sit alone between takes, rubbing the bracelet on her left wrist and staring at nothing. As Natalie approached her early teens, Maria began preparing her for the next phase of her career. The child roles were winding down, and the industry was shifting toward stories about teenagers navigating first loves and family conflicts. Maria saw this transition as an opportunity and started introducing her daughter to older men in the industry who could open doors. These introductions were framed as professional meetings, but Natalie sensed the underlying pressure. Maria would dress her carefully, coach her on what to say, and wait outside hotel rooms or private dinners while Natalie sat through conversations that made her uncomfortable. The previously insulated child was abruptly thrust into highly transactional environments, mandated to charm and impress adults twice her age. Maria's instructions were clear: smile, listen, and never do anything that might jeopardize a future opportunity. The obedience Natalie had practiced since childhood now extended to these new encounters, and she learned to compartmentalize her discomfort the same way she had learned to ignore the pain in her wrist. By 1952 and 1953, Natalie had appeared in more than 20 films as a child, and the transition to teenage roles was well underway. Maria pushed her toward parts that required more emotional depth, preparing her daughter for the day when innocence alone would no longer be enough. The fear of water remained a constant undercurrent in Natalie's life. She avoided swimming pools and beaches whenever possible, and even scenes near water on set required extra reassurance from Maria that the prophecy would not come true if she stayed obedient. The bridge accident had made the fear more real, and the crooked wrist served as a daily physical reminder of what happened when things went wrong on a set. Natalie carried both the visible bracelets and the invisible weight of knowing that her safety depended on never stepping out of line. The girl who had fallen into that churning stream in 1949 had survived, but the lesson she took from the experience would shape every decision she made for the next 3 decades, right up to the night she stepped onto the deck of the Splendor and faced the dark water once more. As the decade progressed, Natalie's reputation grew beyond child parts. Studios began casting her in stories that explored teenage emotions, first crushes, and family tensions. Maria saw each new contract as proof that her strategy was working, and she tightened her oversight accordingly. Natalie's social life was limited to studio-approved events, and even then, Maria accompanied her to ensure nothing went wrong. The family home had become a place of constant preparation, with Maria reviewing every line and every gesture until Natalie could deliver them flawlessly. The injury from the Green Promise remained a private matter, discussed only when Natalie needed to choose jewelry that would conceal it. She learned to adjust her posture and her movements to favor the right side when possible, a small adaptation that became second nature. The pain had long since faded, but the reminder of that day on the bridge stayed with her, a quiet echo every time she felt the bracelets shift on her wrist. The early 1950s also brought Natalie into contact with other young performers who were navigating similar pressures. She observed how some of them rebelled and were quickly sidelined, while others adapted and kept working. Maria pointed to those examples as warnings, telling Natalie that obedience was the only reliable path. The girl listened and internalized the lesson, becoming even more careful about what she said and how she behaved. By the time she turned 15 in 1953, Natalie had already developed the habit of reading rooms and adjusting her demeanor to keep everyone around her comfortable. Maria praised this skill and used it to arrange more strategic introductions to people who could advance her daughter's career. These meetings were presented as normal parts of the business, but Natalie felt the weight of expectation every time she sat across from an older executive or director. She smiled, listened, and remembered her mother's instructions, all while feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that she had first experienced during the bridge collapse years earlier. The transition from child to teenage roles happened gradually, with Maria guiding every step. Natalie appeared in Just for You and the Rose Bowl Story, projects that allowed her to show a slightly more mature side while still maintaining the innocence audiences expected. Maria reviewed the scripts in advance, cutting any lines she considered too risky and coaching her daughter on how to deliver the rest. On set, Natalie continued to earn praise for her focus and reliability, qualities that had been forged through years of strict discipline. The bracelets on her left wrist became a familiar sight to the crew, though most assumed they were simply a fashion choice. Only Maria and a few close family members knew the true story behind them, and Natalie never spoke about the injury unless directly asked. By the mid-1950s, Natalie had become a recognizable name in Hollywood, and Maria's ambitions grew accordingly. She began looking beyond the family films toward more dramatic material that could establish her daughter as a serious actress. The pressure to perform perfectly never eased, and Natalie adapted by developing an internal discipline that allowed her to separate her real feelings from the character she played. The bridge accident had taught her that pain could be endured if the work continued, and she applied that same principle to emotional challenges on set. Maria reinforced this mindset daily, reminding her daughter of the consequences of failure and the importance of staying useful. The family home remained a place of rehearsal and review, with Natalie practicing scenes late into the evening until Maria was satisfied. The girl who had survived the collapsing bridge without proper medical care had become a young woman who understood that her value lay in her ability to keep performing no matter what. The early 1950s closed with Natalie poised for the bigger breakthroughs that would define the next phase of her career. She had already appeared in over 20 films, supported her family through consistent work, and learned to navigate the expectations of studios and her mother with quiet efficiency. Maria's control had created a young actress who was professional, cooperative, and deeply attuned to the needs of those around her, even at the cost of her own comfort. The lessons of 1949 had become part of who Natalie was, a foundation that would carry her through the coming years of fame, relationships, and eventual marriage, all the way to the night when the dark water she had feared for so long finally surrounded her once more. The girl who had fallen from that bridge had learned to keep moving forward, but the cost of that forward motion would only become clearer as time passed. As 1954 gave way to 1955, and Natalie turned 16, Maria saw the moment had arrived to move her daughter from child parts into roles that demanded a more mature presence. The studios were hungry for teenage stories that captured the restlessness of post-war youth, and Maria positioned Natalie at the center of that shift by arranging a series of private introductions to men who held real power in the industry. These meetings were never called auditions. Maria described them as casual dinners or drinks where Natalie could make useful connections. She chose the dresses herself, rehearsed conversation topics, and waited in the hotel lobby or outside in the car while Natalie sat across from executives, directors, or established stars who were old enough to be her father. The girl who had once learned to smile through pain on a collapsing bridge now learned to smile through discomfort of a different kind, keeping her voice steady and her eyes attentive because Maria had made it clear that these encounters were the price of staying relevant. One evening in the summer of 1955, Maria drove her daughter to the Chateau Marmont, a hotel known for its discreet bungalows and its place in Hollywood history. Natalie was told she would be meeting a major star who could help her land a breakthrough role. Maria dropped her off at the entrance and reminded her to be charming and agreeable. The man waiting in the suite was Kirk Douglas, then in his late 30s and riding high after recent successes. According to later confidences shared with her sister Lana, the dynamic rapidly devolved from a professional meeting into a forceful, unmitigated physical assault orchestrated by Douglas, who had arranged the introduction through studio channels, made advances that quickly turned forceful. Natalie, still only 16 and conditioned for years to avoid conflict at all costs, froze in the way she had been trained since childhood. Conditioned entirely for compliance, she endured the assault in paralyzing silence, the assault leaving her physically hurt and emotionally shattered. When it was over, she left the bungalow on unsteady legs, found her mother waiting outside, and rode home in silence. Actively avoiding any request for forensic details, Maria simply mandated absolute silence regarding the assault because reporting it would end her career before it had truly begun. The family closed ranks around the incident, treating it as something that had to be buried so the work could continue. Natalie carried the shame alone, learning that her body could be used as currency and that her pain was something to be swallowed in service of the bigger picture. The trauma settled deep inside her. Natalie began to doubt her own worth outside of what she could offer powerful men. She developed a pattern of seeking protection from older, authoritative figures, believing that if she attached herself to someone strong enough, she might feel safe. That same summer, she met director Nicholas Ray, who was 42 and preparing to cast the lead female role in his new film about teenage alienation. Ray had seen Natalie in smaller parts and was drawn to her natural vulnerability. Their professional relationship quickly became personal. Maria encouraged the connection because it meant access to a major project. And Natalie, still raw from the Chateau Marmont encounter, found in Ray a figure who seemed to offer guidance and affection. She spent time at his home discussing the script and rehearsing scenes late into the night. The affair was intense and complicated, with Ray's own personal struggles adding to the emotional weight. Natalie poured herself into the role of Judy in Rebel Without a Cause, drawing on the confusion and loneliness she felt in her real life to give the character depth. The film, released in 1955, marked her breakthrough as a serious actress. Audiences responded to her performance, seeing a young woman who conveyed both toughness and fragility. But few understood how much of that fragility came from events that had happened off camera only months earlier. The success of Rebel Without a Cause brought Natalie more attention and more opportunities, yet it also intensified Maria's control. With her daughter now a recognized name, Maria tightened the schedule and the oversight. Natalie appeared in other films that year, including One Desire and The Silver Chalice, balancing the demands of publicity tours and studio commitments while still processing the events of the previous summer. She confided fragments of her feelings to Lana during rare quiet moments at home, describing the fear that had paralyzed her at the Chateau Marmont and the way she had learned to disconnect from her own emotions to get through the days. Lana, who had watched her sister's rise with a mix of pride and worry, tried to offer support, but Maria's presence made open conversation difficult. Natalie threw herself into work as a way to cope, memorizing lines and hitting marks with the same discipline she had shown since childhood. The bracelets on her left wrist remained part of every outfit, a silent reminder of an earlier injury that now seemed small compared to the deeper scars she carried. By 1956, Natalie's career had gained real momentum. She starred in The Burning Hills and The Girl He Left Behind, roles that required her to project confidence and romantic appeal, while inside she navigated the lingering effects of the previous year's trauma. Maria continued to arrange strategic meetings, always under the guise of advancing the career, and Natalie complied because refusal was never an option she had been taught to consider. The pattern of seeking safety in powerful men became more pronounced. She dated several older figures in the industry during this period, relationships that were brief and often left her feeling more isolated. The public facade of a rising star completely masked the private reality of a young woman heavily conditioned to link her survival exclusively to absolute subservience, even at great personal cost. Lana later recalled how Natalie would sometimes sit in their shared room late at night, staring at her reflection and wondering aloud if she would ever feel truly safe or in control of her own life. The pressure to maintain the image of the perfect young star took its toll. Natalie began experiencing moments of intense anxiety, particularly around water or any situation that reminded her of vulnerability. She avoided beaches and pools whenever possible, but studio demands occasionally required her to face those fears on camera. Maria would stand off to the side during those scenes, offering the same reminders she had used since the bridge accident years earlier, urging Natalie to push through because the work came first. The girl who had once fallen into churning water on a film set now found herself repeating the pattern in subtler ways, submerging her own needs to keep the career afloat. Between films, she tried to find small pockets of normalcy, reading books or spending time with Lana, but Maria's schedule left little room for downtime. The family home remained a place of constant preparation, with Maria reviewing contracts and planning the next move as if Natalie's life was a production that could never pause. In 1957, Natalie met Robert Wagner at a studio party. Wagner was 27, already an established leading man with a polished image and a reputation for charm. Their connection was immediate and public. Maria approved of the match because it fit the narrative of a wholesome Hollywood romance that could boost both careers. Natalie saw in Wagner someone who appeared strong and protective, qualities she had been trained to seek. They began dating openly, and the relationship quickly deepened. Wagner's attention felt like a safe harbor after the turbulence of the previous years, and Natalie allowed herself to believe that this could be the stability she had never known. They married on December 28, 1957, in a ceremony that was covered extensively by the press as the perfect union of two rising stars. The wedding photos showed Natalie radiant in her gown, smiling beside her handsome new husband. But the reality inside the marriage soon revealed its own tensions. Wagner expected a certain image of domestic perfection, and Natalie, still carrying the habits of obedience, worked hard to meet those expectations, even when they conflicted with her own needs. The early years of the marriage were marked by the same pattern of compliance Natalie had known all her life. Wagner enjoyed boating and owned a yacht, and Natalie, despite her deep fear of water, joined him on outings because it mattered to him. She would grip the railings tightly during rough passages, her knuckles white, forcing a smile for any cameras that might be present. The dark water she had dreaded since childhood was now part of her weekend routine, a weekly confrontation she endured to keep the peace in her new home. Maria continued to offer advice from the sidelines, reminding her daughter that maintaining the marriage was as important as maintaining her career. Natalie balanced film work with the demands of being a wife, appearing in films like Marjorie Morningstar in 1958 and Cash McCall in 1960 while trying to build a life that looked ideal from the outside. Privately, she struggled with the same feelings of self-doubt that had followed her since the events of 1955. She confided in Lana during the occasional visits, describing how the need to please had followed her into marriage and how she sometimes felt she was performing even at home. The couple's public image remained strong through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. They attended premieres and industry events together, presenting the picture of a successful Hollywood partnership. Natalie continued to take on challenging roles, earning critical praise for her work in Splendor in the Grass in 1961, a film that explored themes of youthful passion and repression that resonated with her own experiences. The performance earned her an Academy Award nomination, and for a moment it seemed as though the years of control and compromise had finally paid off in the form of genuine artistic recognition. Yet the underlying patterns remained. Maria's influence lingered even after Natalie had left the family home, with phone calls and advice that reinforced the old lessons of obedience and image management. Wagner's own career ambitions sometimes created friction, and Natalie worked to smooth over any disagreements by putting his needs first, just as she had once put Maria's needs first. The marriage, like the career before it, became another arena where Natalie applied the survival skills she had learned as a child. By the early 1960s, the couple had settled into a routine that included regular time on the water aboard their yacht. Natalie hated every moment on the boat, but never voiced her full terror, believing that expressing it would upset the balance they had built. She gripped the rails and focused on the horizon during rough weather, the same way she had once gripped the planks of a collapsing bridge years earlier. The fear never left her, but she had become expert at hiding it behind the composed exterior the world expected. Lana, who remained close, saw the strain and worried that her sister was repeating the same cycle of self-sacrifice she had known since childhood. Natalie pushed forward with her career, starring in Gypsy in 1962 and Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963. Roles that showcased her range and earned further acclaim. The public continued to see a star at the height of her powers, but the private reality was a woman who had never been allowed to fully claim her own voice or her own boundaries. The first marriage to Wagner ended in divorce in 1962 amid growing tensions, but the two remained connected in the public eye and would later reconcile. In the years immediately after the split, Natalie continued working steadily, appearing in films that allowed her to explore more complex characters. She married Richard Gregson in 1969 and had her first child, Natasha, in 1970, experiencing a brief period of domestic focus that felt different from the pressures of her earlier life. The birth brought a new kind of responsibility, and Natalie threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she had once brought to her film roles. Yet the old patterns were never far away. When the marriage to Gregson ended in 1972, she turned again to Wagner, remarrying him later that year. The second union carried the same dynamics of control and compliance that had defined the first, but now with the added weight of two daughters from her previous marriage. Natalie balanced family life with occasional film work, appearing in projects that fit around her responsibilities as a mother. Throughout the 1970s, Natalie's fear of water remained a constant undercurrent. She continued to join Wagner on the Splendor for weekend trips because it was important to him, gripping the railings during the bad weather and forcing herself to appear relaxed for the sake of the family image. The yacht became a symbol of the contradictions in her life, a place of supposed leisure that triggered her deepest terror, yet one she endured without complaint because that was the pattern she had known since she was a small girl on a collapsing bridge. Maria's influence had faded as the years passed, but the lessons she had instilled remained firmly in place. Natalie had built a successful career and a family, yet she still operated from the same place of obedience and self-sacrifice that had been drilled into her as a child. The trauma of 1955 had never fully healed, and the need for powerful protection still shaped her choices, even as she tried to create stability for her own daughters. The late 1970s settled into a steadier rhythm for Natalie after the remarriage to Wagner in 1972. With Natasha already a toddler and Courtney arriving in 1974, she devoted most of her days to motherhood in their Beverly Hills home. Mornings began with breakfast together, school drop-offs, and afternoons filled with park visits or quiet reading sessions on the living room floor. Natalie made sure the girls had space to draw, play music, and ask questions without the constant oversight she had known growing up. Wagner's television and film commitments often kept him traveling, but when he was home, the family shared meals and weekend plans that centered on the Splendor. Natalie packed the girls' life jackets herself and kept extra blankets on board, turning the outings into something the children looked forward to, even as she managed her own internal tension around the water. The yacht offered Wagner a sense of escape, and Natalie participated fully, standing at the rail during crossings and keeping conversation light so the family atmosphere stayed calm. By 1980, Natalie had begun to accept occasional projects that fit around her responsibilities at home. She appeared in a few television films and considered stage work, but her priority remained the girls' routines and the stability of the household. The couple's public appearances together continued to project harmony, with magazine spreads showing them as a blended family enjoying the California lifestyle. Privately, Natalie balanced the demands of supporting Wagner's career with her own need for quiet time at home. She read scripts in the evenings after the girls were asleep and discussed them with Wagner when he returned from location shoots. The Splendor remained a regular weekend destination, and Natalie continued the practice of joining every trip, gripping the railings during any rough patches and focusing on the horizon to steady herself. The girls loved the freedom of the deck and the small adventures near Catalina Island, and Natalie made sure those memories stayed positive for them. In early 1981, Natalie accepted the role in Brainstorm, a science fiction drama that excited her with its technical challenges and exploration of memory and emotion. The production involved long studio days with Christopher Walken as her co-star, and the two worked well together, sharing ideas about their characters during breaks. Filming wrapped its main phase in November, leaving a short holiday window before reshoots. Wagner suggested they celebrate Thanksgiving with a short cruise on the Splendor, inviting Walken to join them along with Captain Dennis Davern, who had been with the family for years. Natalie agreed, seeing it as a chance to relax after the intense shoot. The group left Marina del Rey on November 27th and anchored near Catalina Island the next afternoon. The weather was cool and damp with light rain at times, but the mood on board was initially relaxed. They explored the island during the day and returned to the yacht for an evening meal. Thanksgiving dinner on the evening of November 28th began with wine and conversation around the table. The four adults talked about recent projects, with Walken sharing stories from his work and Wagner responding with growing sharpness as the night wore on. The discussion turned personal, touching on career choices and loyalties, and the tone shifted. Voices rose. Wagner's frustration built until he grabbed a wine bottle and smashed it against the table, glass scattering across the deck. Natalie watched the escalation without raising her own voice. Instead, she quietly left the group and retreated to the master stateroom, closing the door behind her. The argument had triggered the same internal response she had developed years earlier. Step back, create distance, avoid direct confrontation. Inside the cabin, she changed into her nightgown and the red down jacket she had brought for warmth on deck. Sometime after 11 o'clock, Natalie left the stateroom again. The yacht sat anchored in a sheltered cove, but the water remained choppy from the earlier wind. She may have gone to check the small dinghy that was knocking against the hull, or simply to get air after the tension below. She stepped onto the rear deck alone, the red jacket visible under the yacht's lights. The Pacific was cold, around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the night was dark except for the faint glow from the boat. On a nearby vessel anchored a short distance away, Marilyn Wayne and her companion were awake and listening to the quiet. They heard a woman's voice cut through the darkness, calling out clearly and desperately for help. The cries lasted nearly 15 minutes. "Help me! Someone please help me! I'm drowning!" The voice carried across the water, growing more urgent. A man's voice answered from the direction of the Splendor, calm and almost casual. "Okay, honey, we're coming to get you." The calls continued, then stopped abruptly. Wayne noted the time in the direction of the sounds, later reporting them to authorities. On the Splendor, the atmosphere after Natalie went on deck remained strangely still. Wagner had already withdrawn to his own cabin earlier, choosing not to involve himself in what he saw as a private marital matter. Captain Davern was aware of the raised voices and the smashed bottle, but years of working for Wagner left him hesitant to act without instruction. Demonstrating a chilling lack of urgency, Wagner completely failed to raise an immediate alarm or organize a search. The group remained on board without activating the yacht's searchlights or calling for outside help. More than 4 hours passed before the Coast Guard was finally contacted in the early morning hours of November 29th. By then the sky had begun to lighten. Search teams located Natalie's body floating face down near the dinghy at approximately 7:30 that morning. She was still wearing the red down jacket, wool socks, and nightgown. The jacket had absorbed water and become heavy, acting like an anchor in the cold sea. Her blood alcohol level was elevated, and tests later showed medication for motion sickness and pain in her system. The initial coroner's report issued shortly afterward classified the death as an accidental drowning. The bruises visible on her body were attributed to the fall from the deck and the motion of the waves against the yacht. The case closed quickly, and the public narrative settled on a tragic accident involving a woman who had long feared the water. Natalie's funeral took place a few days later in a private ceremony attended by family and close friends. Wagner spoke briefly, expressing shock and sorrow. The girls were shielded from the full details at the time, and the family retreated from public view to grieve. Lana, who had remained close to her sister over the years, sat through the service carrying her own quiet questions about the events of that night. In the decades that followed, the story refused to stay closed. Captain Davern began speaking more openly in interviews and eventually in a book, describing the argument, the smashed bottle, and Wagner's decision to delay any search. He recounted how the group had stayed aboard without immediately looking for Natalie despite the late hour and the rough conditions. Those accounts prompted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to reopen the case in 2011. In 2012, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavajiswaran, conducted a supplemental review of the autopsy findings. The new examination noted fresh bruises on Natalie's forearms, shins, and face that appeared to have occurred prior to entering the water. The pattern on her arms and legs suggested defensive positioning, as if she had been grabbed or had tried to resist being pulled. Abrasions documented on her cheek and neck completely contradicted the mechanical physics of a simple slip from the deck. The medical examiner concluded that the injuries were consistent with some form of physical interaction before the drowning. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department named Robert Wagner a person of interest in 2018, citing inconsistencies between his statements and the timeline, as well as the delay in notifying authorities. Wagner has always maintained that Natalie slipped while trying to tie the dinghy after it began banging against the yacht, and that he searched for her as soon as he realized she was missing. Despite the forensic inconsistencies, formal charges remain unfiled, leaving the investigation in a state of indefinite, active suspension. Lana Wood has spoken publicly about her belief that the full truth has not been told, describing the night as the end of a long pattern of control and silence that began in their childhood home. The debate continues among those who followed Natalie's career and those who study Hollywood history, with some accepting the original accident ruling and others pointing to the witness accounts, the defensive bruises, and the 4-hour delay as evidence that the events of that night involved more than a simple misstep. Natalie's body was laid to rest at Westwood Village Memorial Park near other figures from her era in film. The daughters she had worked so hard to protect grew up without her, carrying the legacy of her films and the questions surrounding her final hours. Brainstorm was released posthumously in 1983, dedicated to her memory, and audiences saw her final performance as a poignant reminder of the talent that had been cut short. The Splendor was later sold, its name changed as if to distance the vessel from the events of that November night. Yet the story has never fully faded. It surfaces in documentaries, books, and conversations about the cost of fame and the way power operates behind closed doors in the entertainment world. The lethal event on that cold November night permanently closed the timeline, ensuring the exact biomechanics and timeline of her death remain a highly contested, unsolved forensic anomaly for anyone who looks closely at the price paid by those who lived in the spotlight. Her life had been shaped by the need to please, to perform, and to keep moving forward no matter the cost. That same drive carried her through decades of work, marriages, and motherhood, until the final night when the pattern she had learned as a child met the Black Pacific in a way that no one could fully explain. The bruises documented in the later autopsy and the voices heard across the water that night suggest a confrontation that ended in tragedy, yet the official record still leaves room for interpretation. What remains undeniable is the long shadow cast by years of control, silence, and the belief that personal fear must be set aside for the sake of image and family harmony. Natalie Wood's final moments in the water she had dreaded since childhood became the last chapter in a story that began with a frightened girl on a collapsing bridge and ended with a woman still trying to hold everything together for the people around her. The films she left behind continue to be watched by new generations, showing a performer who could convey both strength and vulnerability with equal skill. Her daughters have spoken of her with love and respect, emphasizing the warmth she brought to their childhood despite the pressures she carried. The yacht Splendor is gone from the family, but the questions about that Thanksgiving weekend remain part of Hollywood lore. The case may never reach a courtroom conclusion, yet it stands as a reminder of how easily silence can surround someone even at the height of fame. Natalie had spent her life learning to endure, to smile through discomfort, and to place the needs of others first. In the end, that habit placed her on the deck alone in the dark, facing the water that had been prophesied for her since she was small. The story does not end with easy answers, but with the recognition that behind every polished performance, there is often a lifetime of unseen effort and unseen cost. Natalie Wood's journey from child performer to screen icon to the woman found in the Pacific offers a clear view of how control, fear, and loyalty can intersect in ways that no one outside the moment can fully judge. Her legacy is the work she left on film and the conversation after her death continues to spark about protection, power, and the importance of listening when someone calls for help in the night.